You're sitting in the tavern and you look up to see seated in the corner, away from the fire in the shadows, is a stranger you could have sworn was not there a moment ago. This person is wearing a hooded cloak that conceals their face.
All right, so who else is in the tavern?
Who else is in, there's a pig farmer named Mike having a drink by the fire, and there's a drunk goblin dancing by himself near the bar.
All right, so I'm gonna stand up and I'm gonna go over to Mike. And
The pig. You want to talk to the pig farmer?
yes, indeed, I do.
Okay, so as you walk over to Mike's table, the stranger catches your eye, and you still can't see their face, but in the darkness of the cloak, you do see almost a glow from two distinctly serpentine eyes.
All right, so what does Mike the pig farmer have to think about what's going on in the local area?
You're asking Mike. This is Mara and Ben for Stellar Strategy Gaming. And today we're talking about new DMs and just generally bad DMs, because to be honest, some of the worst DMs I've dealt with have actually been some of the most experienced. Talking about some of the problems you'll run into as a new DM and how to counter them and make your games work for you and your players.
Yes, and I think we should really start off by defining DM or GM, depending on what game you're playing. But a DM, or Dungeon Master, or if you're playing one of the 6 other good role-playing games out there, GM, or Game Master, is the person who effectively runs the game. They are the architect of the story, though they should always take those building blocks from the players 9 times out of 10 for a truly immersive storyline. And they are the people who manage the rules and say what goes and what does not go within their world.
Yes, and a couple of things that people sometimes misunderstand about how DMing works. A common mistake is that you come to think of it as you against the players. You're trying to beat the players in the game, which is not the mark of a good DM or a GM. If you're trying to beat the players, then you're doing it wrong. The goal here is to provide your players with a fun game experience. And that brings in the second problem you run into as a DM, which is sort of illustrated with Mara's and my little intro. If you're DMing a game with the idea of this is the story that I'm going to tell, you have to keep in mind that your players just might not be that interested in it. Now, the first campaign I ever played in started with an intro almost exactly like the one I just did, and being a new player at that time, I was kind of with it. I had never had this experience before, so I sat down with the mysterious cloaked figure, and off we were to the races. Someone who is a little more experienced in the game may want to actually talk to the pig farmer or the goblin and gather a little bit of intel. It's not just something players do to spite the DM. But if you're a new DM, it can be very off-putting because you were planning on telling your story and now the players are doing something that doesn't really jive with that.
Yes, and something that people tend to get confused about when they watch videos critiquing DMs is not all DMs are bad. We're definitely not saying that. Some great DMs are definitely out there. Matt Mercer, famously, he brought DM back into the spotlight after the disaster that was 4th edition and really redeemed the entirety of the game in the public's eyes. And I've personally been in several games with other great DMs. Ben here is one of the best DMs I've ever experienced. No offense, but that's not a particularly high bar from some of the other people we're going to be talking about here. But also, a friend of Ben's, Matt, was a great DM. And so, yeah, we're by no means are we saying everyone is bad. We all have our favorites, but we are definitely trying to just put people onto some basics that will help them avoid some of the most common pitfalls of DMing.
It's something Mara just touched on that I'd like to expand upon a bit. You can have been a bad DM up until now and then have a great session, or you can have been a terrible DM up until now and have a great session. In the first campaign I ever ran myself as a DM, I decided, since I had never DM'd before and I wasn't quite sure how combat would play out, I basically gave the party some very, very weak enemies to fight, and I tailored them to the setting. They were in a situation where the city they were in was in the process of being both invaded and overthrown. So after this very light combat, it was clear that these were peasant rebels who were attacking, and that gave some flavor and context to the story. Like, oh wow, things are really bad. Like peasants are just attacking people on the road. In a later campaign, I did something very much like that. Mara was playing an artificer, which was not a class I was overly familiar with, so I needed to give Mara a light encounter in order to get a sense of how this class would play, to make sure that I didn't under or overpower later more serious encounters. And what Mara commented on after the fact was that everything was fine, but those villains were not very interesting. It was very much like fighting a cardboard cutout of an enemy as opposed to an actual enemy. And that was a situation that I think can happen with DMs where you get too comfortable doing the same things over and over again. Now, if those things work, that's great. Keep doing them. Just make sure you don't start to forget the things that make them work. Because if every villain is the same, or if you start leaving out the creativity and ingenuity that made it good in the first place, which you often see in brand new DMs, then it really loses something.
And to expand upon the mentions of copying and lack of creativity in some new campaigns, I actually, going back to my earlier point about Matt Mercer especially, something that I've seen time and time again is that people love to copy Matt Mercer. And Matt is a great DM. I've watched Critical Role. His campaigns are the stuff of legend. If you haven't seen them, I actually do recommend you go do them. However, to reference another great channel, XP to Level 3 recently did a video on DMs who watch Critical Role and then just try to be Matt on a fundamental level, which isn't good for D&D. It isn't good for the campaign you're running. People like a DM with an individual personality and with their own style of DMing. So if you just copy Matt Mercer, who everyone has watched at some point or at least heard about, it's not going to be fun or interesting. That actually, while there were some other problems with this DM, one of our former DMs, Martin, at the time, before I watched Critical Role, I thought he was a pretty good DM, and he was clearly experienced, and while I had some complaints about how he ran things, he seemed like he had a very good grasp of the rules and a very good grasp of roleplay. After I watched Critical Role, I realized he didn't necessarily have any of that. He was just going off of what would Matt do. Like, seriously, his style was just cardboard cutout Matt Mercer.
Yes, and to expand on that situation a little more, this person Mara just referenced had been DMing for a long time, so my guess would be that either he happened to have a style similar to Mercer's, or it was a situation where he saw Mercer's and decided, I need more of that, which would have been fine. It's just it loses some individuality and it loses some authenticity when you copy another DM. Anyone who's listened to me talk knows that I tend to talk in a monotone, so doing character voices is just not my strong suit. And it doesn't have to be. You can fill it in other ways. What you have to do is figure out what to you makes the story, what your strong suit is in terms of making an interesting and compelling story, and what gets the players interested in the game. The other thing you have to do, as I've referenced a bit, is you have to be ready for the players to not do what you think they're going to do. So if you have this whole pre-planned skit where you've got the voices for the NPC you're going to play all planned out, that can go sideways really fast. First campaign I DM'd, the players came upon a village that had been abandoned and the same symbol had been carved into every doorpost. There was no sign of any violent struggle. And I was going for kind of a creepy vibe, and the hope was that, yes, Mara was there for this, which was giggling. The hope was to go for kind of a creepy vibe in the setting, so I was going to spend some time with the players in this abandoned village. There wasn't really anything there. I didn't have an encounter planned, and that was part of what was going to create the vibe I was going for. Was in some ways it's scarier when you're expecting a fight and there isn't one. What happened was that the players took one look at this village from a respectable distance, saw what I was describing, and said, yes, we know this place. This is the village of Nopesville. Nope, nope, nope. We are out of here. And that would have been fine, except I hadn't planned anything else for the night. So I had this meticulously planned, creepy, abandoned village, and I wound up having to end the session like 45 minutes early just because the players didn't do what I expected them to do.
Well, that session is sort of legendary to the point where I like to explore. You know, I'm a bit of an explorer type person myself. No, not happening. But while that one's legendary, there's also another session which comes to mind, which is almost the exact opposite of that, which stems from a similar problem, which is the Bravinio session. The legendary Bravinio session. The person we referenced earlier had an NPC named Bravinio, which everyone hated, and perhaps later in this video we will talk about the issue of DMPCs. But clearly the DM had a specific idea for what Bravinio was going to be doing this session, and he did not expect all of the players to dogpile Bravinio and stop him from doing that. And it was a horrifying experience as well, because I believe Bravinio rolled 4 natural 20s in that entire encounter, while the players rolled less than 10 on a regular basis, which, by the way, tip to new DMs, always expect the players to roll badly on average. That is, you cannot expect them to roll well. But the Bravinio session was truly a nightmare, and it really exhausted our characters, consumed spell slots, consumed our energy for the game, really. That was when that campaign started going south for me. Like, well, there were problems before that. It was the Bravinio sessions really what put me off of it. And sorry, last thing, that is an example of the session actually taking longer than it was supposed to, because it took us an extra session to get back into the storyline because of all of that, because we had to take a long rest and wrestle Bravinio and all that.
Mara said about the natural 20s and the players rolling low reminds me of a very, very big issue for me with not necessarily a new DM issue, but a rules lawyer issue. You don't have to have your players roll for every single thing they do. For example, I touched on this in a previous video. If I'm going to take a sip of a cup of coffee, I'm probably not going to fail at that. Yes, I might drop the cup, I might spill it. 99 times out of 100, I'm going to easily succeed at this task, and it doesn't do anything for the story if my character is sitting at a tavern taking a drink of his drink, for him to fail at that. It just makes things take longer, and you also get into the situation of, okay, I failed at drinking my coffee. I'm going to pour myself another cup of coffee, and then I will drink that coffee. If you're having one of those days where you're just not rolling well, it doesn't add anything to the story. It just makes it tedious and time-consuming. I had a situation in a different campaign where we had actually had a great session up to this point. It was creative, it was engaging, and then there was a metal door that the players...
Oh god, the metal door session.
That the players came to, where it was clear that the DM had set up a puzzle for us to open this door, and whatever the DM had intended, we didn't figure out. So we decided to just force it, and the DM just kept having us do roll after roll to force this door. A couple of things. One, we can open the door or we can't. There was nothing stopping us from opening the door, so doing check after check against whatever DC the DM had in mind for moving this door, it didn't add anything to the experience. It would have been better to just say, you can or you cannot do this. And actually, a campaign I ran, I had a similar situation. Players came to a door with a rope across it and then some buttons on the wall. The barbarian of the party said, I'm going to walk up and I'm going to cut that rope with my axe. It did occur to me to have him roll for it. The thing about it is that if he had nat 20'd and I had said, you fail, that would have been a real letdown for the player. So instead what I did was I just said, you swing your axe at the rope, you get a good hit on the rope, there is no damage to the rope. And that clearly told the party, this is not going to work, you're not going to get through this way. And the party had to figure out the puzzle. Speaking of puzzles, be ready for your your players to not figure out the puzzles. Be ready for your players to just come up with a solution, and you say, you know what, that was the solution.
Yes, and also with the roll problem, I think that it's actually a mark of a fairly good DM when they say, okay, you've rolled 3 natural ones in a roll or whatever it is, roll again, or use a different dice or whatever it is. Like, for example, recently, the campaign that Ben's running for me right now, I think I rolled 2 natural ones after an NPC that I control rolled a natural one. After a goblin that he was controlling or something like that rolled a natural 1. So it was completely ridiculous. I've never seen a run of luck that bad. And I think I just asked, can I use a different dice now, please? Because it's not fun to roll 3 natural ones. Like, 1 natural 1 can be fun, I'd argue. If you do it right, tragedy can be funny and can add something to the campaign. But 3 natural 1s in a row, when you're this seasoned level 5 adventurer who's been doing this for what's likely the majority of his life, not fun. Not fun, no. And also, in a campaign which I'm running for him, I actually remember he also rolled very low on a regular basis, and it just got to a point where I was like, roll again. Because it was just, it's not fun.
That's getting into rule of cool, and that's the kind of thing you want to discuss with your DM at session 0, because you want to know with the DM, are there going to be things that I can just do? Am I going to have to roll every time I try to do anything? And if I roll 5 natural 1s in a row, what happens? It may be that the DM is just going to say, yes, you are going to, every time you walk up a flight of stairs, you are going to make both a strength and a dexterity check in order to accomplish walking up a flight of stairs. And if the DM is going to do it that way, it's good to know that in advance, so you can either discuss it, hey, I really don't want to play that way, accept it, this isn't what I had in mind, but for the sake of the group, I'm going to go ahead and do that, or just opt out of the campaign, say, you know what, thanks boss, but this isn't going to be the one for me.
Yes, and just an official note from the channel, our opinion on DMs who force their players to roll when going up flights of stairs, as this has actually happened to me, is don't do it. Otherwise, we do not endorse you as a DM, and indeed, you are bad and beyond saving. But yes, I do get where he's coming from, though, that discussing that beforehand is very important. And I think that a lot of this, and a lot of the problems with new DMs, can be fixed with discussing things with either more experienced players, or one thing that I love to do is every time before I run a session, I go on the D&D subreddit, because there are some, it's online, so there are always some people who don't give good advice. At the same time, I always find some very good advice there, so I always recommend, and I think that all solutions can be solved, especially in D&D, by talking to someone else, player or no. And
we're running a little bit short on time, but I do want to get back to an issue, a very good issue that Mara brought up, which is NPC inserts. A great NPC can really make a campaign, but it's very important that the NPC not take up more time than the players, and especially that they not do it in more than one session. If you have a quest giver type or a guide type NPC, for a session, that NPC might be doing more than a player, simply because there might be more for them to do. For example, in the session where the party gets the quest, they may need to interact more with the quest giver than, say, the barbarian would have anything to do. If it becomes a repeated thing, if the NPC becomes the focal point of the campaign, or if the NPC's relationship with one player becomes the focal point of the campaign, it's time to back off. You as the DM are not there to run the show. One of the things the wrestler Mick Foley used to say was that he was there to make other people look good. He wasn't the most attractive or charismatic guy, so if he was in the ring with The Rock or Triple H or whoever, he was there to make that other person look good for the camera, and it improved the show. And as the DM, you have a very similar role. You're there to give the players something to interact with. You're there to roll for the monsters that they're going to defeat on their heroic quest. You're there to narrate what is happening in response to their actions. I'm going to toss it over to Mara to wrap it up. As always, Internet, please tell us what you think. We want to know what your opinions are on what makes great DMs or what makes terrible DMs.
Yes, and if you enjoyed this video, I would ask that you please like and subscribe. Both Critical Role and XP to Level 3's videos will be linked in the description below. And so we hope you have a great day, and leave a like and comment.